Okay, continuing on with the book of Matthew. We are now in Matthew 14. A lot of the material in this, well, all of it really, in this chapter in particular, is going to be stuff that we did read about in Mark. So none of this is going to be new, at least in terms of the subject matter. We are entering a phase in the Gospel of Matthew of increased opposition and resistance to Jesus. We just got done having, he was reading about a variety of responses that people were having to him and his message, some positive, some questioning, some negative. And we're going to be focusing increasingly on the negative responses from the authority figures, which will cause Jesus to withdraw to remote regions and focus on training his disciples in private for a period of time before beginning his journey to Jerusalem, where his mission will climax with what we call Holy Week. So, but that's getting a bit ahead of ourselves here. Right now we're still kind of in the phase where he's wandering around Galilee. And he sent his disciples out to minister in pairs, set them out in pairs. We read about in Mark that it was during this point in time when the disciples were out on their jobs, their training, you could say, that Herod heard about it and was curious or frightened about what it meant. And now we're going to read about this as well in Matthew. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the reports about Jesus. And he said to his attendants, "This is John the Baptist. He has risen from the dead. That is why miraculous powers are at work in him." Now we'll read in Luke when we get there that this was apparently some kind of an ongoing discussion amongst the officials in Herod's court about what was going on. And Herod, at this point in time, seems to have concluded that this is John the Baptist, risen from the dead. Which means at some point previous to this, he had killed John the Baptist. So we don't really know exactly when in the timeline John the Baptist was put to death. When we read about it happening, he has already been dead for some time. So it's hard to say exactly when in the sequence of events that actually happened. Presumably, we know from Luke's account that there were members of Herod's household who became followers of Jesus. So presumably, the gospel writers and the church at large at this point in time got this information about the inner workings that led to John the Baptist's death from these Herod family or court members that were familiar with such details, presumably. But it seems as though they didn't know exactly when it happened, because none of the Gospels actually fit John the Baptist's death into the proper sequence time-wise. So every time we have it talked about, it's in reference to it having already happened at some point previously. Anyway, Herod had arrested John and bound him and put him in prison because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. Herod had met this lady, decided he wanted her, so he divorced his wife to get Philip's wife. For John had been saying to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." Herod wanted to kill John, but he was afraid of the people because they considered him a prophet. On Herod's birthday, I guess he's willing to put him in prison, but not willing to kill him. On Herod's birthday, the daughter of Herodias, so this would be Herod's stepdaughter, danced for them and pleased Herod's. I don't know if that's a sexual dance or if she's just performing. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe in the Greek word there might be a specific meaning behind that verb dance that gives you a little bit of insight into what kind of dance it was. I mean, our word dance covers a lot of different things. There's, erotic dances, there's entertaining dances. So I don't know what kind of dance this was. Maybe the original Greek word has a more nuanced, particular definition of what kind of dance, but oh well. And pleased Herod so much that he promised with an oath, and he probably was drunk when he said this. This was his birthday. This was clearly a party. He was probably drunk when he said this. But he promises an oath to give her whatever she asks. We read about a drunk king making foolish promises or vows back in the days of Esther, and her husband, the king of Persia at the time, was it Artaxerxes or Xerxes? Prompted by her mother, so apparently she went to go ask her mother what she should ask for. She said, "Give me here on a platter the head of John the Baptist." So Herodias didn't like Herod either. In fact, she was probably the one prompting Herod himself to have John arrested, most likely. I mean, I'm sure Herod did not like John's calling him out and pointing him out as a sinner and as Our Lady sayings, but my guess is, knowing the way these things tend to go, the mastermind behind the plot to arrest, clearly the mastermind behind the plot to behead him, and likely the mastermind behind the plot to arrest him in the first place, is probably Herodias. That stands to reason. On Herod's birthday, the daughter of Herodias stands for them and pleased Herod so much that he promises an oath to give her whatever she asked. Prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me here on a platter the head of John the Baptist." The king was distressed. But because of his oaths and his dinner guests, he can't lose face in front of his dinner guests, he ordered that her request be granted and had John beheaded in the prison. His head was brought in on a platter and given to the girl who carried it to her mother. John's disciples came and took his body and buried it, and then they went and told Jesus. When Jesus heard about what happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. So right now, Jesus is trying to keep a low profile. And this is going to continue for much of the rest of his ministry, at least until he goes on into Jerusalem. As evening approached, but that's hard for him to do because he's such a well-known figure at this point. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." Jesus replied, "They do not need to go anywhere. You give them something to eat." "We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, they answered. And we'll read about in other Gospels that they got this from a single little boy who apparently had brought his lunch with him. "Bring them here to me," he said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. So it's not like they're just breaking up the same 5 loaves and 2 fish into tiny little crumbs. They're all eating full amounts of food, and they have plenty left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So more than 5,000 actual people, because that word men in the Greek language refers to males in particular. So there's 10,000 plus total, probably, actual people here. And this, of course, goes back to Moses leading the Israelites to the desert by God's direction, and God providing manna for them to eat every day. So this goes back to the prayer he told us to pray, "Give us today our daily bread." He is capable of providing that bread. Now we'll read when we get to John that there was a lot more. This account of the feeding of the 5,000 is recorded in all 4 Gospels. So it was a very big deal. All 4 Gospels record it. They all recorded the basic information about it. We'll read in John that there was more to it than this. This was actually a very significant turning point in the ministry of Jesus, which is why they all get recorded. And we'll get more details about it when we get to John, about how they wanted that bread. They could see that he was providing bread, and they wanted that bread. This also goes back to an account in the Old Testament of Elisha, the prophet, having done something very similar during his ministry. Let's go back to 2 Kings, chapter 4, starting in verse 42, the end of the chapter. "A man came from Baal Shalishah, bringing the man of God," that would be Elisha in this case, 20 loaves of barley bread baked from the first ripe grain, along with some heads of new grain. Give it to the people to eat, Elisha said. How can I set this before 100 men? The servant asked. But Elisha answered, give it to the people to eat. But this is what the Lord says, they will eat and have some left over. Then he set it before them, and they ate and had some left over, according to the word of the Lord. So even here, Jesus' miracle has an Old Testament precedent, in that to show that God, the Lord, can provide. Jesus is not interested per se in providing them with all the bread they could ever want to eat. This is not to say that these needs are unimportant. He talks about in the Sermon on the Mount that your Father knows that you need these things. He will provide them for you. But these people, as we'll read about when we get to the Gospel of John, were focused really a lot on that bread. They wanted that bread. And although Jesus was willing to provide the bread, and he did already, and he said, your Father knows that you need them. He will provide this daily bread. He said for us, told us to pray for this daily bread, but their focus was on the bread itself, and he wanted their focus to be something else. The bread itself was not the focus. It was simply a sign to point them to the true focus, and they were missing that point. So part of the reason why, now the Matthew, Mark, Luke Gospels don't go into any detail here about this, but all of the Gospels record this event happening, and that he then goes off and walks in the water, which is what we're going to read next. But there was an encounter between Jesus and the crowds who wanted to make him king based on this miracle. That's going to cause division, and that is why Jesus is going to essentially retreat and go somewhere else with his apostles by themselves. And we'll read all Matthew, Mark, and Luke will all record that happening, but John will give us more information about exactly what caused that to happen. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. And like I said, there's a lot more to that than just that one sentence. We'll read about that when we get to John. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Doesn't seem as though it's a storm, but it does seem like it was a fierce wind that was going against them. During the fourth watch of the night, this would be between 3 and 6 a.m., according to our time, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the apostles saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. It's a ghost, they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, take courage, it is I, or I am, actually is what he says here. Do not be afraid. Lord, if it's you, Peter replied, tell me to come to you on the water. Come, he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. Now, in Mark's account, that's it. We don't read about anything happening after that, really. In fact, in Mark's account, we don't even read about Peter calling out to them in the first place. But here in Matthew, we do read about that happening. We read about the somewhat embarrassing event that happens to Peter afterwards. Peter got out of the boat, walked in the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, Lord, save me! Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You of little faith, he said, why did you doubt? And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized Jesus, they sent word to all the surrounding country. People brought all their sick to him and begged him to let the sick just touch the edge of his cloak. And all who touched him were healed. That indicates the story of him healing the woman that had the bleeding issue who touched the tassel on his robe has spread. People now either have an association of minds, all you have to do is touch his clothes and you'll be healed. Now, when they say Son of God, let's go ahead and read a passage in the book of Job. Some of these may seem obscure. Sometimes when we plumb the depths of the Old Testament to find some of these references, they may seem obscure. But you have to remember that these men who were with Jesus, his disciples, would have known this stuff. They would have heard it in the synagogues. They would have heard it in their households. They would have grown up hearing it, memorizing it, reading it, having it spoken to them all the time. So they wouldn't have been obscure to them. It may be obscure to us because we don't spend all of our time reading the Psalms or memorizing or singing the Psalms. In this case, I'm going to read out of the book of Job. But they did, so it wouldn't have been obscure to them. Job chapter 9, this is part of the response that Job gives in his first round of, after the first round of criticisms he received from his friends. Talking about God, he says, let's start in verse 5. He moves mountains without their knowing it, and overturns them in his anger. He shakes the earth from its place and makes its pillars tremble. He speaks to the sun, and it does not shine. He seals off the light of the stars. He alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. So they are starting to associate God, Jesus, with the Son of God. As time goes on, the term Son of God we, of course, have for 2,000 years associated this with Jesus himself. But you have to remember that in ancient history, rulers constantly applied this title to themselves. In fact, even in the Psalms, we read about this when we read the Psalms, the king of Israel was often portrayed as the anointed one of God. That's what the Messiah ultimately comes to be. But you go back and you read Psalm 2, which talks about the anointed one of God. Well, they're talking about the king. And yeah, the final fulfillment will be in the Messiah king. But the idea of being a son of God goes back to, it was fairly common throughout ancient history. As you even read that in Genesis, when the sons of God came to the daughters of men. Well, that probably means the self-appointed rulers, the men who claimed to be sons of God, took women for themselves because they did that. They said that they had the right to do that, and they did. And if you had a problem with it, you either fought back and succeeded, and you became the next son of God, or you died. That's pretty much how it was. Caesar was known as the son of God at this point in time. So it doesn't necessarily mean that at this point the apostles were completely on board with Jesus himself being God. That gradually happens throughout the ministry, and even, I'm not sure if they really completely get it until even after his death and crucifixion and resurrection. And so you have to understand the level of nuance here and the progress of their understanding as they go from seeing him from a rabbi to the anointed one. And again, what that actually means. To them it means a king. He's going to be the king. And the Son of God, we think of it as being like the personified, God in the flesh, which they will get to that point. They will get to that point later on. And when these Gospels are written, they're at that point, and the writers of these Gospels think that. But at the time that these accounts are happening, the apostles may not quite have understood it in that way. And again, it gets kind of confusing because we have to keep track. We have to keep separate in our minds what the apostles thought later in their ministry, at the time, for example, when they actually wrote these accounts, versus what they thought at the time these accounts are happening. The accounts we get, the written accounts of Jesus' life and their ministry, happened after it was all over. And the apostles themselves have come to the point where they see now Jesus as the incarnate Word of God. And John will make that very clear from the very beginning of his gospel, for example. But at the time these things are actually happening, they haven't gotten to that point yet. And that can be confusing as we parse through the differences there. And it's important to keep that in mind.